Kyle here from All Media Reviews, here to do one of two parts probably of today being um, May 18th, 2026. 30 years ago, Kevin Matthew Gilbert, when passed away, he was found dead in his apartment from auto asphyxiation. The story's been documented, but you can read about it. I made a video about what if Kevin Gilbert was still alive back in the year 2015, and I'm going to sort of do a follow up update and expanded version of that in this. So I'm going to kind of reiterate some of the stuff in that previous video, which I still kind of agree with, and then going over a bunch of other stuff just for this video. Then there'll be another video about the other big project on this whole thing. So Kevin, 1996 was working on. He'd almost finished work on The Shaming of the True, and then his band Caviar had been you know, working on demos and stuff like that, he would have finished The Shaming of the True. It probably would have been called The Shaming of the True, but I still don't believe it would have ended up identical. But anyway, and then it would have ended up then the Caviar Sessions, which came out later in the year 2002, would have become something he would have done more with. There would have been more Caviar work. He probably would have released. I think he would have stuck with that style specifically, but he would have done more. There would have been a couple of albums at least a few, and they might have even toured. So explored trip hop. I don't believe the whole thing with Genesis would have happened. I think he would have taken that edition, and I think, like I said in the video from 2015, he would have ended up doing one of two things or both, performing with them live. And he would have produced with them. So Calling All Stations might have ended up as a Kevin Gilbert produced record, or at least he would have been a guest on it, maybe, and or anyway, he would have worked with Dream Theater and Falling into Infinity, which came out in 1997, which had a lot of music that was recorded and written that didn't end up on Falling into Infinity, ended up on the Clean Up the Closet fan club CD, and then later on the Lost Sessions or whatever it's called. I He would have had to battle with the label. That's the only issue I would have been challenging. Um, I think he would have found some way to compromise since it wasn't actually his music. So it would have maybe ended up in some kind of hybrid. I don't know if Metropolis Part 2 would have ended up on there. But then I could see him later working on Metropolis Part 2. And Scenes from Memory could have ended up a little different, having a little bit of Kevin's stamp on it. But songs like "Raise the Knife" and "Speak to Me" and um, the one that's so huge. A lot of those songs would have ended up in there, and some of the mixing on that record would have been different, but the label still would have had some control over it. But would it Falling on Infinity have any hits that it didn't have? Kind of doubt it though. You or Me, maybe it wouldn't have been You Not Me. The whole Desmond Child thing might not have worked with Kevin. So would have done more film scores. In fact, that would have been a lot of his bread and butter. So he would have been commonplace, been continuing to do that. He would have gotten some. I bet you he would have ended up in some Grammy and Academy Award recognition in some respects for that. Then he would have worked with Mike Portnoy. And that whole thing with Transatlantic or Second Nature might have happened, or maybe because Kevin being so interested in humor might have been a sort of offshoot. Um, and then someone like Matt Mahaffey from Self somehow in the whole process of he did the jingle for um, Velot, Travelocity and was it Travelocity? Or anyway, him and Matt Mahaffey would have sort of maybe gotten wind of each other to some degree, and not that they would have necessarily collaborated, but become aware of each other if they wouldn't have collaborated. He would have written books for sure. I would have written at least one, maybe two books because he was so literate. Poetry and or just observations. Would have moved out of Southern California for sure. been pretty vocal act like with politics and been on social media. Although in 1996 there wasn't social media, so it would have been just email and then probably on message boards for a little while, and then eventually he would have been active on Facebook and probably would have been on Twitter at one point, and then he would have probably jumped ship. He would have found himself using the other social media that we have now the last 10 years and change, 15 years and change. Twitter, and I actually think he would have probably eventually run a Discord channel. He would have been doing that and he would have done a podcast for sure. So classical music, when he had the time, the means, maybe he would have launched some crowdfunding campaigns to record some of his orchestrated works with classical music, even like a whole homage to Burt Bacharach. And I think he would have continued to write and make concept albums. And given his pattern of perfectionism and reworking, some of his songs from the past would have ended up in these records. Not a lot of them, but I mean, that's a thing he probably looked back and it's like, why did I end up doing that? But he just couldn't help himself. So, all right. So some other big points on this, what he would have done. So I think Kevin, as much as he had his strong will and maybe had his level of uh, what's the word? He had his pride with some of his stuff. Him and Sheryl Crow eventually kind of made amends, believe it or not, to some degree. They both covered Steve Miller Band's "The Joker." Um, so I think he would have actually reconciled eventually with Patrick Leonard, and they would have made another Toy Matinee record, and they would have called it the second matinee, not the third matinee. You know, and it would have brought back at least some, if not all, the people that involved: Guy Pratt, Tim Pierce, Mark Bonilla, um, possibly some other people that really were. I could see Roger Manning or some other people that he knew being involved with that as well. Maybe even a guest appearance from Roger Manning, like maybe like Andy Sturmer, one of the other people that in that sort of that new Toy Matinee. Um, that could have been really good, although the question being about how it would have come out, I don't think it would have come out exactly like the first Toy Matinee record. I think from a production standpoint, it probably would have been as good, if not better. But I think just based on trying to move forward and do slightly different things, he probably would have had more horns. And he wanted to incorporate more electronics in it. He would have done different things with it, just knowing Kevin. Um, the other one he would have collaborated with, I just mentioned, is Sheryl Crow. And he might have produced one of her solo records. I don't know if he would have done much more. He would have produced one of her solo, if he made amends with her too somehow. And then eventually that the demos from Tuesday Night Music Club would eventually show up. But he also might have produced that cover she just did of "Digging in the Dirt" by Peter Gabriel. So the another reunion I think that would have happened. I think this would have been spurned largely after COVID. So because COVID made people think about life and life being short, the Giraffe he would have had a reunion with the Giraffe guys, and he would have both done some select shows, probably played some of the progressive rock festivals. I think that's not even question. They would have done that, and not necessarily playing the Lamb Lies On Broadway. They would have eventually done another record, and he would have got the guys from Giraffe, even though they were kind of, not thrilled with when he went off and did Toy Matinee and didn't like commit to them as much. Bygones be bygones. Time heals. Time, forgive and forget. So, so the other people he would have worked with, he would have very, like, without question, would have worked with Nick DiVirgilio. He would have been super thrilled for him to get the gig with Genesis and then Tears for Fears, of course, which had a lot to do with his ability. Nick talked about that in his YouTube channel and some other stories. But they would have reunited. And probably toured. He would have worked with Nick on some of Nick's solo stuff. Probably, he might have even sang on it. At least would have played on it and done some of the composition work. But on Karma and solo records. And I also think from working with him, I mean, he might have worked with Spock's Beard some too. Actually, more with them. Probably for the engineering, the mixing. I think he would have said, "You guys need to do your own thing," but he would have also formed a group with Nick. So Nick, being the multifaceted musician himself, since knowing Kevin Gilbert, they would have formed a duo, and I think, or not a duo, but they would have formed a group, and I think The other guy that would have been involved in that group very likely would have been Dave Kersner. He might have even, been involved with Kersner's career to some degree. And a possible title for their band, this trio, if it would have been, or it might have been more eventually, but you might actually get Portnoy to play on that, come to think about it. Maybe call it the Way Back Home. Or Way Back Home, WBH. All right, the other one he would have reunited with is Robert Ferris. So I forgot Robert Ferris is the Trod CD, which was dedicated to him. Haven't listened to that much of this. It's kind of have a Zeppelin vibe to it, but I think him and Robert, Robert Harris was a member of Giraffe originally, and he co-wrote several songs that I love from Kevin Gilbert. Um, they would have done something together probably, or Robert Ferris would have done his solo career. I kind of think Robert Ferris, he was more of a songwriter. Eventually, he would have released his own music, kind of like Peter Tork. But Robert Ferris would have been another one he would have worked with. Then you would have had the sort of the residual impact he had on so many people, musicians especially. One being notable in the last decade and change, I don't know how recently he was, is Jake Allen, the musician from the state of Michigan, who was cited Kevin Gilbert as being a fan. Multi-instrumentalist, singer-songwriter, very dynamic. So you could also say Joey Eppard because, Jake Allen's music has some similar qualities to 3 and Joey Eppard, but also very different. Michael Hedges element and everything. But Jake Allen, it might have worked on something with Kevin or vice versa. I said Matt Mahaffey. Jason Nesmith, he might have crossed paths with Jason Nesmith. Jason Nesmith is the sort of the son of Michael Nesmith, who is not blood relatives, like only half siblings with the other Nesmith children, but notable as being a soundtrack person in Hollywood. So he would have at least become aware of Jason Nesmith. If not, at some point, maybe they would have worked together. Although if you're working that, it's like a gig, they would have been competing for gigs. The same thing holds true from Adam Schlesinger. Kevin probably didn't ever get the chance to see That Thing You Do, and then Music and Lyrics, and of course later My Crazy Ex-Girlfriend. He would have probably been completely inspired, if not intrigued by the music that he did on My Crazy Ex-Girlfriend, the comedic element to it. Adam would have been someone he would have wanted to work with, or at least again might have been competing with to some degree, but and he probably would have then eventually connected to Fountains of Wayne, and the fact that they were from New Jersey, where he originally was from, would also be another reason. So he might have even worked with, who knows, we might have even had a Fountains of Wayne produced album by Kevin Gilbert. That would have been really cool to hear. Go along the same lines, singer-songwriters like Brian Scary and even Will Wood, Kevin would have maybe eventually discovered. And, both of them are multi-instrumentalist composers. Will Wood being a little more avant-garde, but Brian Scary avant-garde as well. I think the inspiration, we would have ended up seeing some of Kevin Gilbert's both influence on their work and vice versa. Especially with Brian Scary, you would have seen more, because, the piano part, Brian Scary is a descendant of Kevin so easily. Go along the lines, he would have worked more with Keith Emerson, and finally Keith Emerson would release another solo album, and he would have actually had Kevin sing on it. Kevin would have also maybe done an homage to Keith Emerson and ELP live at some point. I think that would have likely happened. Maybe he could have actually done something with Keith Emerson live, doing some of the ELP stuff. So Roger Manning and Andy Sturmer, that whole thing may never ever come to fruition, the reunion of Jellyfish, but another thing is Jellyfish's music and Toy Matinee have a lot of similar qualities, so I'm not sure. But again, from a studio engineering, mixing, producing standpoint, they might have crossed paths, and maybe he would have worked with Andy Sturmer. Andy Sturmer also has done soundtrack work. Ty Tabor and Doug Pinnick. Kevin Gilbert would have found his way, since they were both fans of his, to working with King's X. Maybe they even would have toured at some point together. You would have had Kevin, one of his bands, go on a tour with King's X, actually. Along that same lines, Christian Nesmith. Christian Nesmith, admirer of Kevin Gilbert, did some tributes to Kevin Gilbert. Christian Nesmith, the oldest son of Michael Nesmith. Pretty reasonable chance if the time would work, Christian Nesmith would have ended up working with Kevin. Maybe even Kevin would have found his way, into some of these Monkees-related stuff. Who knows? Kevin Gilbert might have shown up at some of the Michael Nesmith tours. Tony Banks and Mike Rutherford. I think especially Tony Banks, there's a chance that he would have found his way to work with him since they became aware of him with the audition video, the Lamplights on Broadway from Progfest '94. Um, but yeah, it wouldn't have been necessarily be called Genesis, but he would have worked maybe with each of them individually since Genesis is output. He would have been probably seen at those shows, um, just like Dave Kersner and everything like that. And then based on that, actually, he probably would have found his way to collaborating or having a relationship with Steve Hackett. He might have even become a touring musician with Steve Hackett at some point. I could easily have seen that if the schedule would have worked out. Um, so Dean Norris of Breaking Bad discovered Kevin Gilbert's cover of Kashmir. Actor who's been in other things, Under the Dome. Brian K. Vaughan, who I love, was the creator behind that. I think Kevin would have maybe become aware of Dean Norris's fan. He posted that on Twitter. Maybe he would have ended up producing or doing score work with something that Dean Norris did later. That would be my guess. I can't name enough. Better Call Saul maybe, because he was only making cameos in that. So Tim Bonus and Steven Wilson. Well, Tim Bonus was quoted as being a fan of The Shaming of the True, knowing it. So if they didn't collaborate, they at least would have had some kind of relationship in the industry. Maybe Kevin, knowing the whole, especially the connection to Steven Wilson, would have ended up becoming aware of Steven Wilson's music, and who knows, Kevin would have produced maybe a No Man record easily. Although Steven Wilson's like Kevin having that sort of control, but maybe he would have mixed something, or maybe he would have sang on one of their records. Based on that same connection, Kevin might have ended up doing some work with, if not just the Transatlantic thing, but OSI. But also Steven Wilson. At some point, maybe now in the next 5 to 10 years, Steven Wilson would have not discovered Kevin Gilbert's work, but they would have crossed paths to some degrees. Kind of like how Portnoy and Steven Wilson knew each other and like that. They haven't really worked together fully, but and along those same lines, another person in the industry who's been noted at least a Toy Matinee fan is Keith Urban. So through maybe if he ended up in the Grammys, the country music scene, Kevin would have worked with Keith Urban. Maybe Keith Urban would have worked and played on some of his, or did some production work, or do some kind of work with Kevin, either just from an engineering standpoint or production standpoint. So, and the other three that are kind of names that he might have crossed paths with, if not worked with, Casey Crescenzo of The Deer Hunter, Sheena Ringo of Tokyo GN and her solo work, and Gavin Castleton. Now, Sheena, admittedly, unless he would have found his way over to Japan and the Japanese music circles, more of a long shot, but I wouldn't say it would have been impossible, because Kevin probably would have discovered J-pop and K-pop actually the last decade. But, and maybe even Tokyo GN and a lot more of that stuff. Gavin having a very similar approach as a singer-songwriter, like and Brian Scary and Will Wood. I put him in the same kind of category, experimental, doing his own thing, doing various styles, and a multi-instrumentalist. He might have crossed paths. And Casey, I gave him a burned copy of The Shaming of the True. I never heard anything about it, but if Kevin would have got his foot sort of in the progressive rock world, and even Casey knows Mike Portnoy a little bit, even Steven Wilson, maybe he would have gotten more wind of Kevin Gilbert and sort of the approach and the concept album kind of thing. So you could say the same thing about Daniel Gilden of Pain of Salvation. So in a lot of his music, I think new sounds would have come up. He would have brought in a lot of new sounds, styles like vaporwave, chamber rock, post rock, especially post rock. Would have in the soundtrack work, he would have been using some of those kind of drawn out segues and stuff like that with orchestration, and even hyperpop. But yeah, he would definitely have made his opinions, given his opinions on stuff like streaming, YouTube, of course. He probably had a YouTube channel, would have done some YouTube videos, Spotify, because he did all that stuff with being funny and being comedic and being sort of tongue-in-cheek and sarcastic. But he would have had an opinion about streaming, Spotify, and Apple Music, and he probably would have written, and even downloading before that, before like the early 2010s and mid 2010s when streaming wasn't a thing. The 2000s, he would have probably written songs about downloading, and he probably would have made some takes, or would have given his opinions, if not done some tributes to some of the fallen late musicians that did pass away since in recent years, especially. But going back to Michael Jackson and Prince, and then David Bowie and George Michael, and then of course Keith Emerson and John Wetton. Probably would have done more of a tribute to Emerson than I'm even talking about after he passed away, and Greg Lake, and even the Three Monkeys possibly. Um, so that's basically it. I mean, there's more to it, but I have the second half of this, the other part of this sort of what if of Kevin Gilbert was still alive in the year 2026 and lived from 1996 till now. I'm gonna go on the second video, but thank you for watching. We'll see you next time.